recording, and so the second webinar in the webinar series is titled Nuts and Bolts of Canopy Management. And tonight we'll be hearing from Mike White of Iowa State and Tim Martinson of Cornell University. Mike is a viticulture specialist for the Iowa State Extension and Outreach and is a team member of the Midwest Grape and Wine Industry Institute. He provides technical assistance and educational training to vineyards and wineries in Iowa and neighboring states, and he's been working with cold climate wine grapes since 2000. Tim has worked in viticulture research and extension at Cornell since receiving his PhD in entomology in 1990. He's currently the Senior Extension Associate and directs the statewide viticulture program. So I want to remind everyone that as a participant in tonight's webinar, you don't have the ability to speak. If you're having technical difficulties or have questions, please type them in the chat pod over on the left side of the screen. As the talks are progressing tonight, Tim will be answering questions in the chat pod during Mike's talk, and then during Tim's talk, Mike will be in the chat pod to answer questions. We'll also have a short break in the middle of the webinar in which Tim and Mike can answer some questions verbally, and then we'll have time at the very end of the webinar for Tim and Mike to answer a few questions again. So I'm getting everything switched over. And right now I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mike and let him get started with his presentation.
Thanks a lot, Chrislyn. I'm going to put on my time. There we go. I got my timer on. Chrislyn's a pretty tough moderator. She's given me 25 minutes to go through these 25 slides. Before I start this, I want to tell everybody that I am a reformed corn, soybean, forage agronomist, and like many of you, took this on later in life and been working with grapes for about 12 years. When you work with grapes, dormant pruning and canopy management are two concepts that I'll be honest with you, I'm a little slow. It probably took me 2 or 3 years to really get that in to where I kind of understood what I was doing. At the end of this presentation, my last slide, I'll have several resources that I suggest you use. One of them is Sunlight into Wine. That's kind of the Bible. It's mostly oriented towards vinifera, but a lot of pictures, easy to read, about 90 pages. And by reading that, you understand the concept of this canopy and sunlight and air and all that. And it really brings home what the concept's all about. There's a few other resources, book resources that I'm going to be on my last slide. And the last thing is I have a 4-page canopy management document that you can download from the Midwest Grape and Wine Institute. And it's designed to put everything into 4 pages, 2 pages front and back. You can fold it up, put it in your pocket, and something you can take out in the vineyard and kind of reinforce while you're spending so much time out there. So with that, I think I'm going to get going. My definition or concept of canopy management is it becomes a function of the interaction of cultivar, vineyard, site, inputs, and the trellis system. Very little in-season canopy management should be needed if these foundational variables are in balance. And if you put the wrong cultivar on the wrong site, I can just tell you right now, canopy management is just going to be very tough and time-consuming. Dr. Richard Smart, if you consider canopy management and the science of canopy management, most of the work started in the 80s. Dr. Smart was the lead author of Sunlight into Wine. It came out in 1991. He's called the flying viticulturist, does consulting all over the world. He's somewhat semi-retired and lives in Tasmania right now. But in the book, Sunlight into Wine, he says, canopy management is a practice which results in the modification or position of the amount of leaves, shoot, and fruit in space to achieve a desired arrangement. Essentially, you're messing around with the plant above the ground level, and that's what canopy management is all about. David Lowe, who's quoted in this Sunlight into Wine on page 3, and David Lowe, he is a winemaker in South New Wales down Australia. He had his own family winery and then started his own winery, and then it merged into a bigger winery. He's been the leader of several vineyard and winery organizations down in Australia, but for him, canopy management needs to be practiced if one or more of these problems are recognized. When vigor is high and yields are low, when grapes do not ripen sufficiently, when skin color is inadequate, or when sprays lose their effectiveness. And that's sprays losing their effectiveness is key when you're working in humid conditions like we have today. We manage a grape canopy to manage the vegetative vigor, improve sunlight exposure to fruit, foliage, and renewal buds, increase airflow to reduce disease pressure, and for the increased coverage of effectiveness of pesticide applications, facilitate pruning and harvest, promote and ripening and increase fruit quality, reduce plant-to-plant variability within the vineyard. Ideally, you'd like to have each vine about the same size and duplicates of each other. We also like to balance the crop to vine size, reduce chance of winter injury or death. The wetter the site, excuse me one second. The wetter the site, what happens is that you'll often get more winter injury, and you want to make sure you balance that crop load correctly. Here in the Midwest, upper Midwest, this is a picture of the organic matter in the soils. Too much vigor is a very common theme, and we often get organic matters here in Iowa, 4, 5, 6+%, and that means more nitrogen. It means more nutrients, more water holding capacity. And typically, I'd say about 70% of the time is that we're battling too much vigor in here, and we have to figure out how to control that before we start doing canopy management. Here's just a couple examples. This is a La Crescent vineyard up by Decorah, probably one of our nicest La Crescent vineyards in Iowa, northeast Iowa. And this is one vineyard that they do have a mechanical hedger. It's on an upright system, and they do go in later in the season prior to veraison, then they hedge it to get more sunlight into that canopy. The picture up to the upper right is a Niagara vineyard that's in north of Indianola here. Very aggressive growth, high fertility soils. In this case, I just want to point out is that they're probably doing a little bit more canopy management than you need. I call that kind of a Dutch boy haircut. They're really cutting too much. Ideally, you'd like to have somewhere between 12 to 20 nodes or leaves per shoot remaining after you do hedging. And it's based on the number of clusters. For one, if 12 to 15 leaves per shoot if there's one cluster, probably 15 to 20 if there's two clusters per shoot. It's probably a good trend line you can look at. So we want to tackle that vigor first, and then by putting the right cultivar on the right side. And because vigor is such a big deal in the upper Midwest, I wanted to address that a little bit with common methods to reduce vigor. One is reduce or eliminate nitrogen applications. For some reason, we have this corn grower mentality, and we're going to throw nitrogen on there anyway. Well, that doesn't always work. Typically, we may be putting on 30 to 50 pounds, somewhere around that bloom period. Often, this nitrogen isn't needed. It's best to do some petiole sampling right around bloom for boron and nitrogen. Those are the two nutrients you go in at bloom, and then you can kind of get an idea if you really do you need any more nitrogen. You can narrow or eliminate that vegetation-free area under the vine. You started your vineyard, it was 3 foot wide underneath there, nothing growing. As that vine matures and develops a bigger root system, maybe you can start narrowing that weed-free area so you're offering more competition to the vine, and you can hold back that vigor. Maybe you can interseed some more competitive grasses with deeper root systems. Many of the vineyards here in Iowa, in the upper Midwest, have bluegrass, this very shallow rooted grass. Maybe what we need to do is plant some other more aggressive varieties like fescue, smooth brome, or orchard grass out there. We can shut down or reduce the supplemental irrigation. That's just common sense. Many of the vineyards don't have irrigation, but if you do have it, maybe slow that down or shut it down if vigor is a problem. You can get more buds per foot of row of canopy by going to like a GDC or maybe a 4K Niffen or something where you're putting more buds on that plant. You're going to have more of a crop load to hold it back. And by GDC, I meant Geneva double curtain, where you have 2 wires horizontal each other, maybe 40 inches apart. You can seed some late seeded cover crops out there, maybe like oats, spring barley, spring wheat, something that'll get up to maybe a foot tall. You do this in like mid-August. You get to maybe a foot tall, die out in the winter. It will provide some erosion control and some mulch for the next season. But this can suck up extra nitrogen that may be there and also extra moisture that you don't need at that time of year. You can change to a lower, bigger cultivar. You can do this by actually replanting or maybe grafting on a less bigger cultivar out there into the vineyard. And here's something, excuse me, many of us when we got into this, we really didn't know for sure what we were doing. And we looked at the data or what other people were doing around the country, and we put in everything at 7 or 8 feet apart. Well, you put a very vigorous, like a Brianna, Edelweiss, something like that, or a St. Croix on a very vigorous site, and they're 8 feet apart, it ain't going to work. They're just too much bigger. Maybe what we should have done was increase that interspacing 10, 12 feet, or maybe sometimes even more, so that we could hang a larger crop on that plant and keep the vigor down. It all starts with pruning. That's the first step in managing that canopy. You can invigorate it or devigorate the plant. You invigorate it out there, but if you prune too much, what happens is that there's fewer buds, less fruit out there, and what happens is that you'll get a plant that's invigorated and it'll a lot of vigor. You can devigor the plant by leaving more buds. Instead of maybe 30 buds, leave 40 or 50 buds. It'll put on a larger crop. It'll devigor that plant and hold back some of that vigor for you. One thing I want to point out here is this concept of a kicker cane. If you start reading the books and the texts and stuff, you'll often hear about kicker canes. Kicker canes are one way. It's a Band-Aid approach that you can take a sucker up from the base of the plant, train it lower below the canopy, and let it go ahead and produce fruit. Turn it into a cane and let it be a fruiting cane each year. And then what you do is you cut that kicker cane off right about time of veraison. And essentially what's happened is a lot of that excess growth has went into that fruit and below the canopy level, maybe a foot or two off the ground, and you just cut it off. So that's the concept of kicker canes that you can use to help devigor a plant. I show this picture here of dormant pruning. Most of you probably have seen all the pruning formulas. Example, Concord, you leave 30 buds for the first pound of pruning, and then if you have another pound out there, you leave another 10 buds, and you keep on doing that until you maybe 60 buds maximum for Concord. We have these pruning formulas for the different cultivars out here, and it's a good start. But because of our hybrids are often more fruitful on the lower buds on the cane, on that spur, what happens is that typically it's not an end-all. You go ahead and use the formulas if you want to, but you're going to have to probably come back in some varieties and also do some cluster thinning or some shoot thinning. You go out and you weigh a few of them, get an idea what a pound of prunings look like. Pretty soon, it doesn't take about 2 or 3 plants. You do this, and you should be able to walk up to a vine and have your eyes calibrated and guesstimate how many pounds of pruning are on that vine, and kind of quickly do an analysis of how many buds you're going to leave. We're going to go over the different steps. That's what we're doing here. And one of the first steps here is shoot removal. If you look at the literature and what we're working with for vines up, typically 4 to 6 shoots per foot of cordon is what you're looking for. And this is a St. Vincent vine, and you can see before and after where I've cleaned out some of the extra shoots. So I get this 4 to 6 shoots per foot of cordon. Okay, and you do that so you have more sunlight going into the vine. You get more sunlight into the renewal buds for next year, and it also aids in spraying. So typically, if this is done when the shoots are about 12 inches or so, and easier to remove that way. And make sure you do it. Make sure you do it before the tendrils start coming out, or you're going to have problems. That's way too late. Ideally, you do this earlier in the season on the shoot removal. The next step next method here of canopy management is sucker removal. I used to think that hey, get all those suckers off at the base. We don't want those suckers. Well, I'll tell you what over time here up in the upper Midwest, with the amount of winter kill we often get, we often push cold sensitive varieties farther north than we should. We also have a problem with crown gall because some of our vines are on the wrong side or too far north. Anymore, I highly recommend that you leave a sucker with 2 or 3 buds at the base of your plant for insurance purposes, so that if you have to replace a trunk, you have something down there to take up to the wire and replace a trunk over time. So I highly recommend anymore that for insurance purposes, you may want to retain 1 or 2 suckers for trunk replacement later on in the season or for next season. Water sprout removal. When you start seeing a lot of water sprouts on your vines, you need to ask your question, why is that? I mean, it's natural, but what I've noticed is that when you get more injury to your vines out there, winter injury to the like the top of the trunk or on the cordon, then all of a sudden you'll start getting more water sprouts. An easy way to remove these is early in the season when they get about 2, 3, 4 inches or so. A heavy leather glove, or even I've seen a lot of people use like a welder's glove, and you can just run it up down that trunk and knock out those water sprouts. Cluster thinning. Cluster thinning is a concept that, luckily, as vineyard operators, we have about 3 years to start learning some of this before a crop comes on. But early season cluster thinning, what we do there is we're doing it to invigor the plant often, and by removing some of that crop, you're going to invigor the crop, that young plant. The late season, we do cluster thinning primarily to devigor the plant, and then those are cases where you may have some very overly aggressive, highly vigor vines that you're trying to hold back until the rest of the vineyard catches up. One way to do this is that you can leave the crop on there and then go in right about veraison and knock half the crop or whatever amount off. And what that's done is that's held that plant back over time. When you are removing fruit and you're going to produce a small crop early in the season, let's say your 3rd or 4th year vines, and you've got too many clusters out there, one thing you can do with kind of a rule of thumb is if the shoots at the time of cluster thinning, just right around bloom, if the shoots are 12 inches or less, you don't leave any clusters whatsoever. If the shoots are 12 to 24 inches, maybe 1 cluster. If it's more than 24 inches, maybe 2 clusters on there. And you remove all the shoots if the cluster, or all the clusters if they're poorly formed, or if they're at the distal end of the shoot. So again, I have information on cluster thinning in my document that's in the last slide that can explain this more thoroughly. Lateral removal is very time sensitive as far as taking a lot of labor. The best thing to do is do not stimulate laterals, and if you do, trying to remove them by hand can be very frustrating, time consuming, and usually by that time you have the tendrils in there and it just gets to be almost unmanageable. The idea here is the later you start playing with the canopy as far as hedging and that, the less of the problem you should have with lateral removal. And if you're going to remove laterals, probably you want to do it around the fruit zone. That'll give you the biggest bang for your buck. Now we're going to go into shoot positioning. I think this is something that can easily be done, and it's something that you should look at. It doesn't take a lot of equipment to do, but tucking is something we do for VSP vines, the vertical shoot position vines. The varieties and cultivars that like to grow up typically will have 2 or 3 wires placed at the cordon level, and these wires are movable so that as the vines grow up, then what you can do is, let's say the canes get up there and they get up there maybe 18 inches plus in length, you can bring up that first wire and tuck them in and bring them up. And the idea then is you're spacing them evenly, get the sun in there, and get the wind through there. The other thing we do is on the downward canopies, we comb them down. And the whole idea with that is so that we can get, you comb them down. This is a Geneva double curtain down in Missouri, and this is Norton growing there, Norton Cynthiana. But you comb them down. You'll do this maybe several times during the season. You want to start before the tendrils start forming after bloom. Get them combed down. And what you're trying to do is get 50 to 75% of those renewal buds up on the top there, on that top cordon, sunshine to them early in that June period. So as they're developing, they'll be more fruitful renewal buds next year. Often this gets to be a practice you're out there doing often, because maybe like in northwest Iowa we get a lot of wind and it's always blowing them over. But combing, tucking are two things that you should be able to do fairly easy out there. Another concept here, as far as when you invigor and devigor, when you take a vine and you point it upwards, it tends to invigorate a plant. When you take that shoot and that vine and point it downwards, it tends to devigor the plant. So downward combing on a vineyard like to the right here would be another method to help slightly devigorate that vine. So again, tucking for upward systems, combing for downward systems. Leaf removal, this is something that not a lot of people, I don't see a lot of people doing this. You go out into the West Coast, you see it being done on the high-valued crops. Essentially what they're trying to do is, if you have a thick canopy and you have the fruit underneath the leaves and they're not being exposed, what you do is you go in there 2 to 3 weeks after bloom, and you're going to pull maybe 2 to 3 leaves around that fruit to the point where you have maybe 40 to 60% of that fruit exposed, so that you can get sun to the clusters there. Again, if you have a shade problem, it's something to consider. If you don't have a shade problem and the fruit is exposed, I wouldn't be spending a lot of time out there leaf removal. Another concept, if you have north-south rows, you probably want to do this maybe on the east side of that canopy more than on the west. If you have east-west rows, then you're going to probably be pulling leaves on the north side of that canopy to get sun in there. Luckily, we do have machines that can pull the leaves or suck the leaves off that zone. Here's some Cabernet down in Texas. I was down there a couple years, and I just wanted to point this out, the topping. Topping, essentially, typically you're going to do this with like a VSP, a vertical shoot canopy. And what you do is, when those canes get up there and they get 18, 20 inches, whatever, above that wire, they start to flop over and shade the fruit down below. What you want to do then is, we're talking in that period just prior, maybe in the July period, a few weeks before veraison, you can go in there and top the tops out of those and get some sun, keep them from flopping over. I hear in the Midwest, a lot of people just go in there with like Christmas tree shearing knives, and you can pop them off the top, and so they don't shade the fruit down below. Skirting. Probably 2 reasons for skirting. You don't have to do this, but if you have a problem with diseases in your vineyard and you want to get some more air moving out there, if the vines are on the ground, you could go in there, I'm going to say 3 weeks plus after bloom. You want to do it before veraison so you don't affect the maturity of the crop. But 3 weeks after bloom or so, go in there and you can pop off a few of them down below. Maybe have 10 inches, 12 inches of clear space so air can get through there. Also, if they're wrapping around the tractor tires and that, it's a good idea to skirt them at the base, and then so they don't wrap around the tractor tire. Again, ideally, somewhere between 12 to 20 nodes per vine. 2 clusters, probably 15 to 20 nodes. 1 cluster per vine, again, maybe 15 to 12 nodes in there. Hedging is often done to help with harvesting and also to help ripen that fruit. There's mechanical hedgers you get out there, and essentially what you're doing is it's mostly done on vertical canopies, and what you're doing is you're narrowing that canopy down so that sun can get into that fruit. And again, we use that same 12 to 20 rule as far as leaving nodes out there. per vine to ripen that fruit. So there's some trend lines you can follow. This, I've got this in my document, but this is kind of trend lines you want. You know, once you've been in that vineyard for a while and you've hit nirvana and you got to the point where you're right in the zone where you want to be, this is kind of some trend lines you're going to look for. 4 to 6 shoots per foot of canopy, 1.5 to 2.5 leaf layers. This is horizontal leaf layers in that fruiting zone. The nodes per shoot, the canopy gaps, 20 to 40%. What this means is when you walk by that canopy, you can see through the canopy to the other side. You want sunlight infiltrating that canopy and air too. You want the clusters exposed to the sun. You want them out 3 to 6 foot of square feet of leaf area. These are things that you can measure and keep records of. Pruning weight per foot of canopy. Do this at pruning. Some more vine characteristics, and again, you're not going to be able to hit every one of these. It just gives you a trend line or some things to shoot forward to see where you're at. 5 to 12 pounds of fruit produced. Well, the Labrusca varieties are going to probably be that 8 to 12, and the vinifera and the hybrids probably that 5 to 8 pounds. But you can go through there, look at the crop load, look at some of these things, and the whole idea is that about veraison, everything slows down for you, and you don't get a lot of growth out there. Your overall goal in the vineyard then is try to have the plants look all similar. Another thing is that you get conflicting views on some of these things, and when that happens, you just got to remember that experts can often vary in their opinions, and nothing's perfect out there. Further reading, Sunlight in the Wine, I highly recommend that. I imagine most of you have that. I highly recommend that, mainly to get the concept ingrained. The Midwest Grape Production Guide, that's free online. You can read that. Then the Wine Grape Production Guide from Eastern North America, you can order that. I think it's somewhere around 75 or 80 bucks. That is an excellent book to have. And then just a 4-page primer on canopy management that goes over these concepts I just have. You can go online here and download that for free as a PDF document. And with that, I think I'm done.
Okay, I am going to go ahead and switch things over so that Tim's talk can start loading. And Tim, were there any questions that you wanted to
Yes.
answer?
Well, it was really slow until we started talking about cluster thinning, I guess. And then several questions came in. I just want to repeat one from Natalie Peck. How early in the season would you do cluster thinning if you wanted to do it early to invigorate the vine? And I think I tried to make the distinction, Mike, here between defruiting the vine when it's young and what you would do with a mature vine. Did I have that right? You there, Mike?
Yeah, I think you're correct. I thought you were pointing that to somebody else, but yeah, I think you're really, there's 3 types. Your cluster thinning, taking all the clusters off the first 2 years, maybe 3 in some cases, to get the plant growth and root system, and then the first few years, a lot of these varieties will put out too many clusters. You're going to go in there and you're going to be cluster thinning to manage the crop load early. Then you get to the point later on where you get these bigger plants that maybe, in that case, you may want to leave a crop load on there just to hold back the vigor. And then at that time, then you're taking them off at veraison. But yeah, you're correct. There's different reasons to do it as far as cluster.
Okay, here's one. What kind of trellising system would you recommend for Noir and Coro Noir? I would recommend training them high and letting them droop because that's what they want to do. They are not upright growers. Noir has rather large leaves that can shade the fruits in the renewal area. So I think for both of these, I'm all for training them high and letting them droop.
I agree with you 100% on that one. We had one question here. With swings in temperature right now, this is out of Missouri, 65 degrees now, would you go ahead and prune? Yeah, down in Missouri, I think the winter's over, to tell you the truth. I think you have no problem. Go ahead and prune. Long prune, leave a few extra buds so that maybe
insurance
leave
buds, right? Yeah.
More buds.
Okay, here's one I don't quite understand from John Miranowski. What is the issue with nodes per shoot? John, if you could type in something there, and I'm not sure what you mean by that.
I think, yeah, the nodes per shoot is nothing but if you have a cluster on a vine, you need so many leaves to ripen and fill that cluster up. So, you know, the rules of thumb, if you look at the books and all the literature, is somewhere between 12 to 20 leaves per vine that has fruit on it is what you want to mature that fruit on that vine. So I guess I would look at it as 12 to 15 nodes or leaves per vine if there's one cluster. And if you got two clusters out there, you probably want to go that 15 to 20 nodes per vine to ripen those two clusters. What do you think, Tim?
I'm sorry, I was reading and I wasn't listening, Mike. But there is another one that maybe you could address too that I tried to address, and this is from Northeast Wisconsin. Which hand power tool is best for use for hedging? I think we're talking a small scale vineyard here where you're not going to go out and buy one of those big machines. I've seen people actually take duct tape and put it, mount it on a tractor mount and just use a hedge clipper and to cut along the top of the canopy. Have you seen other things, Mike? Or?
Yeah, I would say most of the small vineyards here, if they are hedging, they're probably using, one of those anywhere from $150 to $250 motorized hedger. You can go out there and hedge with that. A lot of them are using Christmas tree knives, the serrated Christmas tree knives. These knives are they're 20 inches of blade and 16 inches of handle, and they're really easy to go out there and work with. And then some people are actually taking our pasture and our sickle mowers that we use in pastures, and they're mounting it so that sickle mower is vertical, and they're using that to do their hedging with.
Yeah, right. Yep, I've seen that as well. Yes, somebody's complaining about scrambled sound. Here's another one from John Kinnaird, and then I think we'll move on after this one. What about Marquette grapes? I think, would VSP be appropriate for them? Yes, I think we had that earlier during the last session, and they are a little bit more upright as growers, but I'm going to defer to you, Mike, on that.
Yeah, I think if you go to the University of Minnesota, their research vineyard up there, I think that originally they had them all on high wire, and they get by with that. I've seen them on 4-cane Niffen too, but the trend line I'm seeing with Marquette here in the upper Midwest is more people are shifting over to VSP. They just seem to grow better on them. Okay, well, I think we're going to start in on my part of the talk then. My name is Tim Martinson, of course. If you joined us late, I'm the Senior Extension Associate in Viticulture here at Cornell University, the New York State Agricultural Experiment Station. And I'm going to have a little bit of a different focus than Mike because I'm going to talk about the costs and benefits. Canopy management is wonderful. There's times when you just really do have to thin the crop and thin the shoots and do a lot of canopy management, but it is, a lot of it does involve hand labor, and so there's some associated costs. Over the past several years, I've been working with Justine Vandenheuvel and, of course, her graduate student Trent Presser, where we've tried to quantify some of these costs and also benefits with, in particular, with hybrid grapes. And before I get started on that, just a little bit about my background here. I've spent most of my time in viticulture here in the Finger Lakes, where we have a wide variety of cultivars. We have a lot of
conventional French hybrids, not the Minnesota varieties, that have been around for 30 or 40 years, and growers who initially started growing them for large producers, and so they have a certain attitude about production, which is production and very cost oriented, because they dealt with these larger processors, and they went through a period of time where their prices that they're getting paid for the grapes were very low, so they really did try and economize on costs, and that's really carried over to the present day. So for starters here, here's a provocative statement: the best canopy management is no canopy management at all. I think in a perfect world, everybody would agree that the shoots would just grow out to 3 or 4 feet. Our vines would be wonderful and in balance, and it wouldn't vary due to weather or other insults, and we just have perfect grapes every year. Now that might happen in some parts of California, but it doesn't generally happen in the east or in the cold climate areas. So I think my overall point of view on this is we have to remember that canopy management costs money, and so if you do it, it's going to cost you something. Sometimes it reduces your yield depending on what you do, and so there has to be a payoff to the amount of time and effort and resources that you put into canopy management, increase quality and marketability. Now, I'm not talking about the entire suite of practices that that Mike was talking about. A lot of that's just good viticulture, but I'm going to focus specifically more on things that reduce your crop, like cluster and shoot thinning. So the bottom line is that you put in inputs, your labor and potential crop, and you hope the output is going to be riper fruit, better wine, more bottles of wine flying out of your tasting rooms, and greater willingness to pay on the part of consumers. So I'm going to modify this and say, well, if it's possible, and often it's not possible, it's better if you don't have to do any canopy management and your vines are just naturally balanced. So I want to emphasize, just as Mike did, that this is one component of a cropping system that really it starts when you establish the vineyard. You choose a certain spacing. If you do rootstocks, you choose certain rootstocks and so forth. You choose a training system, and that determines in part how vigorous your vine is going to be. And then you have a choice of certain pruning intensity, and I've highlighted that here because I think this is one of the key ways that you can control and manage the crop and vigor. And finally, we get down to canopy and crop management, which doesn't mean that it's an extra thing, but it means that it ties in with all the rest of the stuff. So there's a number of things that Mike has mentioned that you can do. You can adjust the shoot number through shoot thinning. You can adjust the cluster number. If you're a table grape grower in California, you might go and make a few snips in the clusters to thin off some of the berries and adjust the crop in that way. And then there's all these things: leaf removal, shoot tipping, and shoot positioning that are meant to modify the light environment. So again, you can affect the yield components, the yield side of the ledger here in the crop load, and you can affect the leaf area and light environment. And some practices, such as adjusting shoot density, do both. Okay, just briefly here, I just wanted to make the point with this slide that basically whatever site you have, it has a certain soil depth and texture, a certain water holding capacity, fertility, and basically that produces a certain size root system, either a large one or a small one, and that's going to influence what you get coming out the top of the vine. It's going to introduce the vigor, the rate of shoot growth, and your vine capacity. Obviously, if you have shallow soils and small vines, you're going to have less capacity to have a crop on than if you have large vines. So what we try and do with Canopy and crop management is, manage this crop load, which of course is the ratio of exposed leaf area to crop, because the shaded leaves, of course, don't contribute to ripening the crop that much. Okay, so I want to start out by talking about 3 different situations we have here in New York, and one is sort of the type of stuff that's written about in Richard Smart's book Sunlight into Wine, where you have vinifera vineyard on VSP or on divided canopies or trellises or whatever. And here's Long Island Merlot that is sold for $25 to $40 a bottle. People get $1,800 to $2,400 a ton for it, so they put in lots of different hand labor operations in this, and machine too. They'll certainly go through and cluster thin and shoot thin, and then might go through and hedge 3 or 4 times a season, and do leaf removal a couple times. So they spend a lot of money. They'll get 2 to 3 tons per acre. But they'll also spend a lot of money growing it, $3,000 to $4,000. $4,000 might be on the high end of things, but certainly they're going to spend, somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,000 an acre to grow it. But the amount of money they get for the wine really justifies putting that much time and effort into it, and so they still make some money on the grapes. Just want to contrast that with this Finger Lakes Cayuga White block that we have. Cayuga White, of course, is one of our cultivars, and this is a vineyard that is trained on umbrella Niffen, sort of high wire, and basically they come in and they prune it, they tie it, they do mulch the vineyard in between the rows to retain moisture and get the vine size up, but essentially he hangs 8 to 10 or 7 to 8 tons of grapes on this every year, and then after the pruning and tying, basically he's done with all the canopy management. The rest is just spraying it three or four times. So he might get $3,500 to $4,800 in returns on this in gross income, and spend $1,500 to $1,800 an acre growing it, and it makes a wonderful high quality wine that he's able to sell at a good price. So that's sort of the other end from this higher end vinifera. And if you want to go further, then we have Concord for juice grapes in the Lake Erie region. This is on GDC, so there is some canopy management going on here, but it's all mechanized. The reason is because it sells for a very low price per ton, and even if you get high yields of 8 to 10 tons per acre, it's costing you quite a bit to grow it, so definitely you're not going to have a lot of hand labor input into this beyond pruning if you prune it by hand. A lot of them are mechanically pruned. Okay, so basically we decided to look at shoot and cluster thinning for hybrids. The idea being that, well, we do all this stuff for vinifera. Which of these things can we apply to umbrella Niffen or a high wire cordon? And what are the things that make sense to do here, and does it make any difference? So we looked at how much does it cost in time and the amount of crop removed, and then of course what are the benefits? How do we modify the fruit composition? Did they turn out more ripe? And ultimately, when people buy the wines at the end, how does it affect the willingness to pay? So we did this in detail at a couple sites with Justine Vandenheuvel, and then I also did a bunch of grower demo blocks, which I'm going to talk about here in a moment. Okay, let's talk about shoot thinning. The best time to do shoot thinning is when the shoots are very short, because they'll break right off, and you can go along like these two gentlemen are at more or less a slow walking speed. And indeed, you should go along at a slow walking speed so that you can keep the cost down of doing it. And basically, their goal here is not to get their perfect 5 shoots per foot of Canopy, but to go in and say, well, it's particularly thick in here, I'm going to grab a few of these and just brush them off and try and maintain a walking speed. If they do that, they can get the time down to about 15 seconds per vine to do this. And that works out to about 3.4 hours per acre, or about $50 per acre if you count the labor at $15 an hour. So that's one component of the cost of doing this, is the labor involved. But the other one that's probably a lot greater in most cases is the amount of crop you remove. And I just pulled this out of the hat. I don't know if they actually removed a half a ton per acre, but if you do, you're going to have a half ton less of grapes to sell. So $750 lower receipts. So in essence, by doing this crop thinning or the shoot thinning, you need to somehow wring $800 more per acre in quality out of this. So that's, I guess, the question that you have to consider when you're doing any of these management practices, or it applies pretty much to any management practice. But so what am I getting out of this? And just to point out how time sensitive this is, okay, if we use our example of 3.4 hours at 15 seconds of vine, what if it takes you twice as long? All of a sudden you're up to 7 hours an acre. If you take a really long time and are really meticulous, then you've tripled the cost, basically. And I put up these other things from Jerry White's Cost of Establishment of Vitis vinifera in the Finger Lakes to illustrate the amount of time that's involved in some other common vineyard operations. So if you do this fast, you ought to be able to do it in about half the time that it takes you to sucker vines. About a third of the time it would take you to do cluster thinning, etc., etc. Just wanted to add on here a few things about VSP, shoot positioning, and the time that's involved in some of those things. I'll get back to that a little later. Okay, so we did a lot of grower demos, and what we tried to do at several of these blocks was actually time how long it took us to move down the row and do the thinning, and assign a cost to that. We also measured yield at the end of the season, and to see how much yield we lost. So here's the bottom line. The ranges that we got here in different vineyards took us from 18 to 42 seconds per vine. Highly variable, but then different vineyards were in different conditions, so it basically took us longer to do some than others. In thinning, sort of the average was removing about a ton per acre, but the range was half a ton to 3.3 tons difference in yield. If you then convert that into dollars, that difference ranged from $450 per acre to $1,650 an acre, and it would basically, to recoup that cost, then as a grower you would have to charge from $50 to $200 more per acre to make up for the lost yield that you had there and the labor involved. Okay, so what impact did this have on measurable fruit quality indices? Well, I want to point out here that really the only difference we saw in the major commonly measured things, there's no difference in berry weight, but we did get a difference in Brix, which is generally related to the amount of crop you have on. Directly affects Brix accumulation, but as you'll notice here, titratable acidity, that wasn't any different, and the pH wasn't any different, so we didn't manage to modify those things. So I want to just so if you're expecting to reduce your acids a lot by doing this, well, it doesn't look, based on our blocks, like that's something that's going to influence the acidity of your grapes a great deal. Okay, I just want to go through what is maybe an atypical thing, but it's one that I have well documented and that has some interesting results. This is Leon Milot on Cuca Lake, and if I can grab the Okay, there we go. So this is the unthinned, and this on the bottom is the thinned, the before and after. And here's the difference in the average cluster size in the unthinned versus the thin. So clearly we had a difference there, and this is what the unthinned canopy looked like and the one with the shoot thinning. So it looks a great deal different. And here's what we found out for yield parameters and so forth. We reduced the shoot number from 44 per vine to 28 per vine. That's about 5 per foot of canopy because these are spaced at 5 by 9. Reduced the number of clusters by half, but 50% reduction in cluster number, but only a 30% reduction in crop weight. The clusters compensated by weighing more, and the berries also weighed more, and there was slightly more berries per cluster. And you can see we did have a difference of 1.5 degrees in Brix, but again, no difference in TA or pH. It took us 18 seconds a vine, 968 vines per acre. So cost-wise, this amounts to, here's what it cost us per acre. And if you're selling the grapes at $800 per ton to maintain even returns, you'd have to be paid $1,162 a ton. If you're selling this to a winery, the winery would need to add 50 cents per bottle to the price of the grapes to pay you back that higher price. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that's $6 a case more or less. So it's a significant cost. But another way to look at it is that if I'm selling the wine and growing the grapes at $20 a bottle retail without shoot thinning, I'm going to have 831 less bottles per acre to sell. That's going to translate into $16,000 lower gross receipts. Or alternatively, I would have to charge $27.50 per bottle to make up the difference and get the same gross returns for that. Okay, so that's basically a rundown of how the numbers work on that. I just want to emphasize that we did the same thing in Traminette, removed a ton per acre, but the loss was a lot less per acre, even though it took us about the same amount of time to trim it. And again, to maintain the returns, then all you need is $90 extra a ton or 13 cents a bottle. So what that points out is that if you already start at a low yield and thin off 1 ton from 3 to 2, that's different than doing 7 to 6. For 3 to 2 tons, then if you get $1,000 per ton, you really need $1,500 a ton to stay even. If it's going down from 7 to 6, then $167 per ton instead of the $500 per ton. Okay, same thing with the wine. I'm not going to dwell on that. But now I want to move to cluster thinning. And if anything, shoot thinning has somewhat indirect effect, or a moderate effect on crop, but with cluster thinning, you're actually you're directly reducing the yield of that vine and hoping that whatever quality you have compensates. So this is a study that Trent Pressler did as part of his PhD project, and basically he had 4 treatments: control, and then light thinning, moderate thinning, heavy thinning, taking this Riesling block down to 1 cluster per shoot. And the thought was, well, we're going to measure the quality difference and do some sensory analysis on this, and also account for the tonnage. So his model here was, well, ask the question, what do I need to maintain a constant amount of revenue per acre, given all this different tonnage that I was getting. So basically what he found is that the more he thinned off, the more he would have to get per ton to make up for the crop that he dropped on the ground earlier in the year. So in the most ridiculous extreme thing, it go to 4,000 a ton. If we look at the other scenario where you say, well, I get $17.50 a ton and thin off part of it, then of course the net revenue goes down the further that you do thin it off. So this is a pretty significant impact, and does point out that if you are doing cluster thinning, certainly that has a very can have a very direct impact on your costs. So how do we measure the benefits? Well, that's a little harder to do. You can really calculate the costs, but one of the ways we measure the benefits is to do sensory analysis. If you're a winemaker, you can sniff and swirl and come up with lots of differences in sensory attributes. So when Justine did this with some of the blocks that we did on Marichal Foch, she found the shoot thin wine was significantly different. Doesn't say whether it's better than worse than the control. Seyval Blanc, the cluster thin wine, was preferred significantly. Coro Noir, shoot thinning and cluster thinning, was fruitier than the control or the shoot thinned alone. So these are hedonistic panels of expert versus panels of consumers. We've tried pouring these wines at conventions and say, well, which wine do you like better, A or B? And what we often find is that it's a 70% like A, 30% like B, or 40-60. It's very often not a clear-cut choice. So the question is there may be these differences, but how does this relate to dollars and willingness to pay and so forth? I want to go through just in a little bit more detail what Justine found with this Marichal Foch block. Here she did two things. One was either shoot thinning or no shoot thinning, and the other one was an early harvest date or late harvest date. These harvest dates were separated by 1 week. And the differences here of these different chemical components that they measured in the laboratory and are related to these flavors here were assessed and measured. So these are actual amount of chemicals present in the wine, and this is expressed as in terms of how different was it from the control one without shoot thinning and with the early harvest. Okay, so the point I want to make here is that if you look at just the shoot thinning with the early harvest, yes, we managed to make the wine fruitier and then reduce these compounds associated with these less undesirable things. So we did that quite a bit, and we're able to do that with shoot thinning. But if you look at no shoot thinning and just delaying the harvest by a week, basically we got the same effect or an even greater effect. So so this was a maturity issue, just waiting a week for harvesting. And if you combine them, then you did get an additive effect. So there certainly was an effect from the shoot thinning that carried over into the wine that was shoot thinned and harvested late. Again, what does this mean in terms of willingness to pay and so forth? So I'm getting toward the end here, but in terms of measurable benefits, again, they are harder to measure. So I think from a grower standpoint, one thing is, well, if I do this, I can meet the winery specs and sell my crop. The person who I buy this from wants me to do this, so I have to do this to sell my crop. So that's a very clear-cut decision, yes or no. I can sell my crop, I can't sell my crop. The other one that is quite significant, especially this year, was if I have an open canopy and do all these practices, do shoot thinning, do cluster thinning, I can better control diseases and come up with cleaner fruit, higher quality fruit. For those who don't have machine harvest like we do here in the Finger Lakes, well, it's often easier to harvest the fruit if they're larger clusters and fewer clusters. And the fourth one, which I think is largely maybe some wishful thinking on the part of growers, is, well, I can demand more money for my grapes if I do this. And maybe you can, but I haven't found that to be the case very often, because it seems like people understand paying X amount per ton, but they don't often translate that into I'll pay X amount more for quality. So what are the quality things that can come up? Well, higher bricks, definitely, with a lower cropping level. Does that always translate into better quality? Well, it might and it might not, because there's certainly more to grape quality than sugar levels. Better color structure tannins. This, I think, is true of certainly reds and things that you want to make into dry tannic wines. It's a little less clear-cut with some of the whites, and in particular, in our region with Riesling, it just doesn't seem like it's had a huge effect there. You can reduce the variability in the fruit. You have less unripe fruit in the mix, therefore raising the quality. And then the better flavors, of course, better varietal character. But the bottom line is, it has to come at the winery. So a winery has to be able to say, because we've done this, I can either charge more or sell more or market better. I can brag about my low yields and how we do everything possible to increase the quality of the grapes, including thinning them down to 2 tons per acre. And so, this is really great wine. Giving more repeat sales. So that's kind of the bottom line, and not quite satisfying, because it's not an easy thing to measure. And really a hard thing to assess, and it comes down to your judgment as to what difference it makes in quality and how that impacts the people you sell your wine to. Just wanted to add a comment here about, in general, about top wire cordon versus VSP, and I guess I'd include umbrella here. And somebody in the earlier presentation said, well, so my main point here is that for the same grapes, if you can do it top wire cordon, there are a bunch of other things that you do have to do with VSP that you may or may not have to do with top wire cordon. So what that translates to in the end is a lot lower labor costs for the top wire cordon than for the VSP in general. I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but I think top wire cordon for many varieties is often more forgiven of, let's say, lax viticulture or sloppy viticulture than VSP is. VSP, if you do it right and do everything, you're going to come up with wonderful fruit. But if you don't, it's going to be more of a disaster than if you were a more casual grower with the top wire cordon system, in my humble opinion. But as Mike said, people often disagree about this. So, just to close here, as you're thinking about these things, and particularly the things that directly influence yield, are the costs equivalent? Are the benefits you get out of it equivalent to the cost you put into? Sometimes that's hard to judge, but certainly it's a good thing to keep in mind as you manage your grape. It's my opinion that just based on places I've seen, is that if you have productive soils, it's often just as easy to undercrop as to overcrop. And so I'm a proponent of if you have big hairy vines, leave a few more buds on and try and get your vigor under control there as the first stop. If you're in a grower and winery being separate situation, I think it's pretty rare that the winery pays as much for the gain in quality as you sacrifice in yield. So certainly here in New York, tonnage sometimes trumps the quality gain that you get, and often the wineries don't want to pay $200 more a ton. That sounds like a lot, even though it costs the grape grower that much. I'm a proponent of hanging as much crop as you think you can ripen consistently. And finally, I think you got to broaden your palette and look at other practices that might have the equivalent impact. And the one example being, waiting a week to harvest the fruit, and you come up with different fruit characteristics. So harvesting at the right time, winemaking practices that can compensate for differences in flavors. So that's my thought, and I want to stress that I'm not against cluster thinning or shoot thinning or reducing the crop. I just think that really, as you go ahead and grow your grapes, it pays to experiment a little bit and see how much of a difference these things actually make, and then modify your practices the next year, based on that. And if you find that you're spending a lot of time and money and not getting much result, well then that means you don't have to do as much work the next year. Okay, well, thank you very much. It looks like I ran a little over tonight at 30 minutes. So we'll open it up for questions here, and well, before we do that, though, I have a couple other announcements. First one is that the next webinar on March 13th is going to be one by economists involved in the project, Bill Gartner and Dan McCole from Michigan State University, Bill Gartner from the University of Minnesota, talking about winery collaboration and economic impacts in the context of the Northern Grapes Project. That should be a very interesting seminar. And then the last thing is, boy, with all the emails going along, this is a webinar that's going to happen tomorrow at Michigan State of a topic that we're all interested in, challenges facing small and medium-sized entrepreneurs in emerging cool climate wine regions. So that should be an interesting thing. And there's the URLs, and if you miss that, then it's going to be archived, of course, for later viewing. Okay, all right, Chrislyn, you can change it over now, and we'll open it up for more questions. Mike, are there any hanging questions out there?
I haven't seen any hanging questions. I think I've answered most of them. A lot of them about, is it too soon to prune, or when do you prune, that kind of deal. I think I covered that.
I encourage everyone to
that's
click
excellent.
on the link there to our webinar survey. It's in the top right corner of the screen. We really do value everybody's responses to this. So please fill out the webinar. Also, the PDFs of tonight's presentations are available again in that file share pod just underneath the slide with the link to the survey.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight and sharing this Valentine's Day with us. It's been very special, and no, seriously, I've really enjoyed doing this with Mike. It's the second time, and it's a lot of fun, and we get a little different response each time. So, so thank you very much, and I think I'm going to sign off now. And our thanks again to Mike and Chrislyn for doing this, and thank you all for coming. Good night.
Yeah, and we will be on. I mean, we're going to shut off the mics, but we'll be on here for a few minutes if you want to keep on putting questions in. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can still answer questions.
Yeah, but we encourage you to, when you do leave, don't just leave your browser running, but sign off. Otherwise, you'll just be kind of connected. All right.
Thank you.